Do you want to go in the middle?
No, sit there, that's fine. That's great. So hello everybody. If there's anybody out there in the coffee room that wants to attend the session on digital identity, please make your way through as we will kick off. So thank you everybody for coming to this session. I'll briefly introduce myself and then introduce our esteemed panel. And then we'll go into a little bit of a presentation on some digital identity research and then some questions to ask the panelists and then take some Q&A from the floor. So firstly, I will introduce the panel. So at the far end, we have Alex Dunn from the Engine Room. Alex is a recovering researcher with a passion for applying creative solutions to difficult problems. She is a hunter and gatherer identifying data and technology strategies that can empower social change initiatives around the world to maximize their impact and make the most of their resources. She co-founded the Engine Room and leads it to be a nimble organization that provides direct support where, when, and how initiatives need it. She sits on the board of HuriDocs and the Technology Advisory Council of Amnesty International. She also apparently plays a mean game of chess. We look forward to. Next to her, I have Yasmina Mccarty from the GSMA. Yasmina is the head of mobile development, where she leads a team of 80 working across 8 global initiatives. Before joining the GSMA, Yasmina co-founded Green Mango, a social enterprise in India, helping low-income entrepreneurs grow their businesses. As CEO of Green Mango, Yasmina was recognized as a TED India Fellow, Echoing Green Fellow, and Cartier Women's Initiative Asia Laureate. And finally, Alex Pirot de Courbois, I apologize if I've got the surname wrong, from Privacy International. Alex leads Privacy International's strategic program, which is focused around building a global privacy movement. Previously, she was engaged on issues relating to human rights, irregular migration, security sector reform, gender, conflict management, and human security. Privacy International works to drive international debates on privacy and elevate our common concerns to international decision-making processes. So firstly, a little bit about what this session is about and what it is we want to be discussing. We have increasingly a wide array of digital identity platforms that people use in everyday life. We have platforms that governments are building. We've heard talk already in this morning's session about the famous Aadhaar platform in India, now with over 1 billion people subscribed onto it. But we also have a lot of platforms that people use in their everyday business. So firstly, we're going to do a very quick bit of audience interaction. I want everyone to think of the last time they had to prove of who they are and use an identity artifact to describe who they are. So the one rule about this is you're not allowed to use the thing you did on the way in here when you had to prove who you were with an ID artifact to get into the conference today. So think back and think about the last time you had to use an identity artifact. Now, hands up if that was a passport. Probably about 30% of the room. Hands up if it was a driving license or a national ID card. Okay, smattering again. Hands up if it was something other than that, but a physical card or form of some description. And a smaller numbers. Hands up if it was a digital identity. Okay, we had about 3 or 4 people that responded to that last one. And we've got a person on the Twitter handle over there saying it. What's interesting is how, when you ask this question, so few people respond with a digital identity. And as part of our research at Caribou Digital into identity, we ran workshops in India and Washington, DC, looking at how research and how people interact with identity artifacts. And it's always interesting how people don't think about the fact that They use identity artifacts every single day in the digital domain, whether it's logging onto Facebook, Twitter, Google, or whatever. And it's actually probably the way in which you interact with identity systems in most ways. So this is a topic that we've been looking at in partnership with Omidyar Networks at Caribou Digital. And primarily what we've been doing is looking at how this is playing out in India, partly because of the ubiquity of Aadhaar as a platform. And this work stemmed from previous research we had done on looking at private sector identity platforms globally, and driven by the fact that we didn't come across a lot of user research. In most cases, identity platforms, whether they're government-backed or private sector created, tend to be very technocratic, top-down decisions. Often the user for identity platforms is the government or the company, not the person who actually has their identity credentials on the platform. So what we wanted to do was really understand the user perspective better, both from a service design perspective, but also from a user experience perspective. So what we're going to explore on this panel is that need for more of a bottom-up user sensibility around the way that identity platforms and digital identity platforms are built and managed. So at the moment, we're just at the end of a series of lots of interviews in India, talking to people about the kind of experiences they have with identity, and not just Aadhaar, their PAN card, their license, their ration book, all kinds of different forms of identity artifacts that people have. And really the need to uncover their pain points and their needs around identity management and capture their experience of managing many different identity artifacts, but from the perspective of low-income users and vulnerable communities. From this, what we want to be able to do in our work is establish principles to improve user experiences and integrate these into these systems whilst really promoting individual privacy, agency, and dignity. And those three words are fundamentally important to the way that identity is managed. We see a lot of issues around privacy. They were referenced in the conversations earlier on this morning in the main session. And that becomes a very important issue when we look at how we manage people's identity online. But also dignity. One of the issues with Aadhaar, in particular with certain cultural groups in India, is as a biometric platform, it forces people to either have a fingerprint or an iris scan, which can sometimes be a process that strips people of their dignity. What we wanted to really do is step back and see identities as practices and not just digital identities as technology platforms, and understand that identities are given and constructed. Identity platforms tell you who you are, but equally you yourself have an identity that you construct online and you construct on digital platforms. That they are material and social. They describe your economic situation in the world, but also they describe your situation within your community and within your peers. And crucially, that they are analog and digital. It's of no surprise to many, but the vast majority of people talk about identity through very analog artifacts. And Aadhaar itself, which is meant to be a digital identity platform, for most people turns into a physical card. There's an entire sub-business in India of taking your Aadhaar number and turning it into a laminated physical card that you carry around with you. And in some cases, we've seen people who laminated the entire form they filled out to have their Aadhaar card because they were unsure which bit of it was a card and which bit of it was an artifact. So there is this real play between analog and digital in the research that we saw. And fundamentally here from one of our interviewees, Devi, we see the kind of way in which identities and identity cards start to expose vulnerabilities and issues around how people manage their identity on these platforms. So in this case, Devi, who is a peanuts seller, says, "I don't understand how anyone could misuse it, his lost photocopied ID, which was an Aadhaar card. And that's why I was quiet. But if I was a rich person who's lost his ID, it would matter a lot more to him and his money. If a poor man's ID like mine is lost, it doesn't matter that someone else at the most will get to know my address and where I live and come and find me. I have nothing to lose, I have no money." And I think this points to a really interesting and very important discussion around risk and privacy and identity that we see a lot in our research. A lot of very low-income users see risks to their privacy as entirely having an economic impact. So when we talk to people like David, we hear people saying, well, if someone steals my ID, I haven't got any money, what can they do? What we don't see, and I think what worries us a bit more, is people understanding that your identity has as much of a reputational impact as it has an economic impact. And actually, particularly when you look at the role your identity plays on social media and digital platforms, the way in which someone stealing or handling your ID on your behalf means that you could be at reputational risk is not aware for people. But also, I think more importantly, what we understand is how identity becomes a very power-structured thing. So in a lot of our research, we saw how an identity artifact may not be held by the person whose identity is on that card or artifact. It may be held by their husband or their in-laws or someone else who exerts person via their identity card. Completely by accident, we actually started our research the week of demonetization in India. And one of the problems we observed was women who had sometimes, held money themselves in rupee notes, then had to repatriate those old rupee notes into either digital currency and digital formats or into the new rupee notes of which there were nowhere near enough printed. To do this, they needed to prove who they were. But if their husband or their in-laws owned their ID cards, going to them and saying, here's all this money I've hidden from you, can I have my ID card so I can formalize it into the new rupee notes, was not an option. So the way that power is exerted over identity at the very local and familial level, and then again at the national level and the corporate level, is a big point of discussion that we'll pick through in the panel. So these themes that we see, as I say, that identities are practices and are full of meaning, even in sometimes the very mundane transactions that people do. And that really digital involvement that shifts rather than removes entrenched vulnerabilities, that actually making digital platforms just moves those vulnerabilities to other spaces rather than removing them for people. And that designers and policymakers can use this broad lens to see and mitigate some of these vulnerabilities and to make systems more empathetic, respectful, and empowering. How do we build identity platforms that give people control over what they're doing and give people control over their lives, rather than systems that seem to exert control over people's lives? Finally, the last thing from me, we ran a workshop in Bangalore on our research, and what was fascinating was we had some people who had been involved in the building of the Aadhaar system, and someone came up to me at the end of the session and said, Aadhaar's been running for many years now, we never did any user research. And it amazed me that you could build a massive technology system that's been used by billions of people and never do any user research. And then in discussing with the person, I said, but you did do user research. Your user was the government. And actually, that was the primary user need that you were trying to solve in the original design of Aadhaar. What we're now seeing is how the ignorance and lack of understanding around individual user needs on the ground can cause a lot more problems in the way that these identity platforms are used. So we will move to the panel now and start to talk to some of our panel of experts to pick up on these themes. And first, Yasmina, if I can go to you. We've seen in many digital platforms, particularly mobile money and other platforms, the role that local people and local intermediaries play in helping people navigate these platforms. It would be good from your experience at the GSMA and understanding how mobile agents have played a role to say how can you empower people and help people navigate these platforms using intermediaries and using those parts of the mobile industry's capability.
Great, and thank you very much to SIF for having me here today. I think first it's important just to set the scene a little bit on why ID, and in particular digital ID, or ID for D as it's being called, Identity for Development, has got such buzz and momentum right now. And that actually goes back to UNGA sort of 18 months ago when they launched the SDGs, and in particular goal 16.9, if you're familiar with it, and I think the panelists this morning talked about a world with peace and justice. Well, part of that is the right to have representation and the right to be represented. So we saw governments really kind of suddenly embrace and get excited about identification systems and thinking about how do we take this, it's either 1.1 or 1.2 billion people who are currently unidentified, and bring some kind of inclusion to that group of people. Quite quickly, you then start looking at digital solutions. You can't begin to talk about ID in 2017 without quite quickly going towards a digital type of solution. And that's where we've started to come in as mobile operators. So in 110 countries now, 110 countries, so about half the world, to get a SIM card, you have to be able to prove who you say you are. So if you want to make a phone call, you have to have some way to substantiate your identity. Now, this is not something we've advocated. In fact, we've advocated against it. We think it's a disproportionate level of verification. But inevitably, this is coming, and about 15% of those cases are demanding biometrics, which is even more disproportionate, right? An iris scan to kind of make a phone call and talk to your loved one. So the private sector necessarily started getting involved, for better or for worse, and getting pulled into this dilemma around what does ID systems. And very clearly, we think that ID systems are a relationship between a government and its citizens. But when you start talking digital, you are going to get the private sector involved. And so I think the way we look at this is that mobile operators and third parties within this digital ecosystem will probably be the scale partners for digital ID solutions. And we've seen that for services like mobile money. They will also be a body which can help think about more digital use cases and harmonized and proportionate requirements. So harmonized means, can I register to make a phone call, and can I also register to use a mobile money transaction? And is that the same level of requirement? And is that simple for me to do, kind of frictionless engagement? Proportionality is, should that be biometric if I'm just sending $5, or if I'm calling my mom, or perhaps should that be a lighter form of identity? So I think you'll see private sector engage very much on scale, as well as trying to engage in a consumer protection framework which has a bit less friction than what we see today.
Okay, moving on to Alex from Engine Room. When we look at the design of systems and we look at user needs within them, what ways and what recommendations would you have about how we build both for longevity and understanding how people's needs change over time, but also build around respecting the user and understanding people do need to be able to prove who they are for certain transactions, but how can we make that respectful of what information we share and something that actually works for them as an end user rather than just for the system they're engaging with?
Yeah, I mean, I think I start looking at these kinds of problems through what we call a responsible data lens. And responsible data, it's a community and it's a concept. The concept is that sort of starting at the level of it's legal or it prevents unauthorized access from information is not a high enough bar for any of the kinds of innovation / experimentation that we're doing on people. And that through that responsible data lens, I see three big topics or issues or vectors to consider when thinking about digital IDs. The first is around informed consent. If there is no alternative to using the system that is rolled out, and no sort of realistic alternative, so saying you can either give us a retinal scan and get food, or you will not get food, but you can opt out of the system and protect your privacy, which is important to you, clearly. That's not informed consent. And I think if these systems are as successful to the government users as they could potentially be, that if that alternative infrastructure isn't built, that we're going to be in a very dystopian future, and informed consent is will be a tick box that we tick, and we won't actually have it, which I think is quite a terrifying prospect and should be really considered in the way not only the systems are being designed, but how alternatives are being built alongside them to make sure that we have the option to opt out should we want to. I think another concept or vector that I think a lot about is around future-proofing, which is used in programming and sort of technology design when we conceptualize what technical infrastructure and advances will look like in 5 to 10 years and try and design systems that can be robust in the face of those changes. In computer science, it's meant to make sure that your product is viable as the infrastructure around it changes. But in this kind of situation, imagining what future changes in technical possibilities with the data that we're collecting is really important to make sure we're not doing things now that make perfect sense, but in 10 years they might actually present terrifying options and opportunities to reuse our data in ways that we couldn't have imagined. We can't predict the future, but we can do our best to make sure we're mitigating possibilities that are within realistic realms. And then the third bit is around governance. So Yasmina talked about, companies get involved when it's a digital project or big endeavor. And so we're talking right now about governments and companies platforms owning massive data sets that will be used to authenticate our access to services and information about us. And if it does have the network effect that is possible with these things, so if it is that this massive success that governments tout that it could be, that data set will be so valuable. I don't even think we can really estimate its value. And if we aren't imagining alongside innovation around digital identification, alternative innovation for governance of this data that ensures that it's managed and held in the public interest, we could also be sort of facing a future where there is a runaway train of data that's been aggregated that we don't have control over.
We will come back to at least two of those points on the size of the data and the consent question in a moment. But firstly, to get input from our other Alex with an I as well. We talk about identity as both a materially and socially constructed entity. And how hard is it for people's own sense of who they are as individuals to match up to what may be a far more formalized concept of their identity within platforms and systems?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you for having us for this panel. At Privacy International, we take a privacy lens to some of the issues that we're working on, and that gives us the possibility to explore questions around dignity, autonomy, and self-determination that require us to consider control, agency, and power. And when we think of ID system, an ID system is not inherently wrong or inappropriate, but it can only be relevant and appropriate if it's about empowering the individual. And at the moment, we're missing that piece from the discussion, from the equation. You mentioned the government as being the user of these ID systems, but ultimately the user is the individual. It's what the individual can benefit and gain from being part of such a system. But they're not part of the decision making. They haven't been consulted as to why they would want to be part of such a system. And also in terms of how we create these initiatives, I think there's a need to differentiate between identification and having people registered by birth so that they can be acknowledged and be included in decision-making processes versus authentication. And I think we're mixing those two terms a lot in some of the initiatives being deployed. I wanted to make 4 points to have a discussion and hopefully generate some questions from the audience. The first one is we're talking about government-led initiatives around identification, but we can't forget that actually a lot of the instigators or the ones designing those systems are not governments. They're either the private sector, but we're also seeing development actors coming in. And that's really important to take into account in terms of accountability, transparency, and jurisdiction. Who are these actors accountable to? The other one is, this is not just a policy issue or a human rights issue. There's a need to be discussing the tech aspects of this as well, both in terms of data at rest or in transit, but also looking at the infrastructure, how these systems created as government and companies have demonstrated they're incapable of securing large, complex IT systems. And so we're baffled that we keep going towards creating these systems that they don't have the capacity to secure. And so that's really important to take into account, that we need to be working in a multidisciplinary approach to addressing these issues, both from a legal, policy, and human rights perspective, but also understanding the technology. The third point I wanted to make, which was also part of my first point, is this is about people. It's about people's identity, but at the moment there's a power imbalance as to who defines what identity means. What are the different criteria, elements that constitute what we each define ourselves to be? And just to share an anecdote that was quite powerful, that I experienced recently. I was speaking to somebody in a country that's currently trying to set up a mass ID system, and this person is transgender. And so in order to be part of this future ID system, they will have to provide their birth certificate. But for them, the person that is written on that birth certificate, be it their name or gender, is no longer who they are. And so when we talk about ID system, there's a real need to consider the evolution or the possibility for an identity to evolve over your life cycle, depending on your interests, needs, political affiliation, whatever it may be. And that, again, is not considered as part of the system. Once you're encoded somewhere and you're an A, B, or C, it's really hard to get yourself out of those boxes. And that's really problematic. The last point I wanted to make is the context in which we're having this discussion. We can't ignore the mass surveillance systems that are being currently deployed both by government but also private actors who are enabling the generation, not just the collection, but the generation of personal data. And also looking more at the private sector in this regard is what we call data exploitation. And it's very much this mass generation of data, and echoing some of the concerns that Alex mentioned just before. We're generating all of this data without knowing what we want to use it for. And so we really need to be considering right now, how do we mitigate it before we cause any harm?
So we will move to get some questions from the floor and from Twitter. So if you have a question, please start putting your hand up, and we can go and find people. We have someone already down there. But I will use the fact that I've got a microphone on to ask one before we go into the floor. Going back to this concept of consent, and actually using that to raise the issue, and building on a bit of what you said as well, Alex, about identity as a product for users and the fact that it doesn't meet up who they see themselves as. Identity fascinates me as a product because, unlike other things such as financial services or other products, there are very few people out there saying, I really wish I had a blockchain-enabled, personally secure, private ID data store. You know, outside of a few tin-hatted security geeks, many of whom may be in the audience. But you know, there isn't a strong consumer desire for that. And what fascinates me is every single time there is a major data breach, and they're getting worse and worse and worse, the collective response seems to be a shrug. And then people carry on ticking the end-user license agreement, because actually what people don't want is an ID. They want a mobile phone or a Facebook account or a Twitter account. Or they want a ration card, or they want the ability to vote. So an identity platform is something you hurdle over on the way to do something else. Will there be a point, or can we do more to make users aware of identity as a product and the issues around it? Or are we permanently going to be in the space of having to try and catch them when they fall and build the right policies and regulation around protecting their rights on their behalf? Because ultimately users don't care. Anyone? Yasmina.
So I have to jump in just on the user point, because I think you started the conversation off very strongly with that this should be a user-centric solution, whatever we're designing. And I just want to go back to that, because I think that is where these systems are failing. Most governments have not one, but 5, 7 ID systems. They have one for elections, they have another one for disability, they have a different one for education, they have a different one for health. This one has 3% adoption, that one has 7%, right? There are an extraordinary number of ID systems which have largely failed. They're not interoperable, and government is not one entity, but many. So I think we have to now, using the opportunity of the digital era, understand and become much more user-centric, and that's been our approach. So if I can just take a moment to highlight some of the findings we had. We did research in Tanzania, which has about 24% hard ID adoption, Cote d'Ivoire, which has 59%, and Pakistan, which has 98%. And there was 3 different themes that came out of these countries, which are, of course, a bit anecdotal. It's not a global survey, but I think it's relevant. The first one is that this 1.2 billion people are not sitting there desperately dreaming of that future ID card, right? They have triggers for which they are frustrated that they can't prove who they say they are, like registering for school or getting a health benefit. But in of itself, identity is not a concept that they're sitting around waiting for us to solve. So I think that's the first point. It is very use case specific of why you may choose to embrace a particular ID technology. The second point that came out very strongly was trust. Where you have high trust in communities, ID systems were less attractive. So in environments like Tanzania, where people can get a letter from their colleague, or they call it a ward letter, people actually said, why do I need an ID system? This is much better. I can talk to my neighbor, I can talk to my councilman, he or she can write the letter. That is a much better way to do business than this government authorized ID card. So high trust actually meant low appetite for ID systems. Conversely, in Pakistan, it was the reverse. They said, absolutely, we need these ID systems because the law and order situation is very complex. It is the right of the government to check who we are at regular times and authenticate who we are at regular times for transactions. And then the third point, perhaps not surprisingly, was gender. Came out very strong and, of course, heavily influenced the attitudes of users on ID systems, but perhaps slightly different than what we thought. So in Pakistan in particular, the women actually said, well, it's not that important that I have an independent ID solution because most transactions still require a husband or a father's signature. So to have a standalone ID card actually doesn't change the game very much for me because in this community construct, I still need to do a lot within the family dynamic, not individually. So gender is certainly going to be an element, and I think we'll see that play out in very different ways in different contexts. So I just wanted to bring these three examples. There will be many more rich treasure troves of data on humans' desire and appetite for identity in the years to come. But I think these are three starting point themes that are really interesting. But the punchline is user centricity. We have to build these systems from the perspective of this 1.2 billion people who need it, not from the perspective of governments and development agencies.
So Alex Dunn, going to you again from a user perspective, what have you seen of what those user needs are, and will users ever reach some level of kind of self-actualization of privacy and identity issues, or will we permanently need to kind of build tools to manage on their behalf?
I actually struggle with the frame of users. I think there's only two industries that call people users, and it's drug dealers and technologists. And I think so. I think that there's something quite passive in the framing of a user, as though they don't actually have any control over the services that are being offered because the power is somewhere where they are not. So I think that it can be helpful in terms of how we conceptualize techniques of inclusion and design, but I think it does stop at the point where we talk about the way that it equates to power structures. And then I think, I mean, for me, like the focus on the sort of technocratic aims of these projects is really important in terms of making people's lives easier, cutting down the sort of faff that they experience. But I think, I mean, the thing that I really worry about is that there is a very short road between technocracy and autocracy. And I think if you can build a perfect system where there aren't multiple forms of ID, I mean, there's actually wonderful anonymity and pseudonymity and heterogeneity of identification. Like the fact that you use one ID for one thing, one ID for another thing, that's actually a powerful concept. So this idea of sort of normalizing and standardizing, I think actually probably will have perhaps unintended consequences that users can't anticipate. But I think that governments should actually hold themselves to a higher standard than just making it easy for citizens to access services. And I think that basically providing those services more seamlessly, while that's a laudable aim, and I think it's an important way of sort of positioning citizens as the employers of politicians, I think that it can cause serious problems when we're thinking about what our standards are. Because if the standard is it's easy to register for school, that's a pretty low bar, and the amount of egregious choices that can be made while that immediate need of a particular individual is met is pretty wide, and I think pretty worrisome. And I think governments are duty bearers. They're responsible for raising the bar in terms of protecting citizens' information, in terms of building systems that are not only in the moment satisfactory, but also sort of put us on a path 10 years from now that we have more just systems. Yeah,
I'd like to point out also the other thing technology companies and drug dealers have in common, as well as using the term user. You get the first hit for free in both situations. Any more questions or comments? Would you like to add in?
Just maybe to add on the perspective of the user, I think there's this assumption of that we're given the choice. And I think when it comes to agency and power, when you talk about identity, is you're making a choice because that's the one you're given, but you're not giving alternatives either. And yesterday, and we had a great session at the pre-sip about financial services and the use of loans. And I think there's parallels to be drawn whether you enroll yourself in a digital loan system because you have to, because you know, you need to buy food tonight for your family, or you need to pay to go see a doctor. That's no longer a choice, it becomes a need. And so if you're not giving alternatives where can you have a choice that meets your principle and your ethics, then I think that's where the issues of consent and choice are definitely problematic.
Yeah, it's worth pointing out for those that aren't completely au fait with the Aadhaar platform in India, it was initially designed and described as a voluntary platform. It is increasingly not voluntary. It is increasingly absolutely compulsory, and we're increasingly seeing how Aadhaar needs to be mapped up against your PAN card for financial transactions, your ration book, etc. So this whole concept that identity platforms give you a choice is just not true. We will start with some questions from the floor, starting over there and then going there.
Hi, I'm Renata Avila from the Web Foundation. I just have a quick question regarding technology sovereignty. Because most of these ideas, I mean, in the case of Guatemala, are produced by foreign company that comes and gets great deal of money. And then if the company goes bankrupt, or if there's a huge flaw in the technology, the whole country is affected. So I would like first to understand your point on who should provide these services. And the second is if there's any model anywhere where you can, which is the best practice or the best standard on digital identity globally?
So we'll go to the second one in a moment. I'll say a quick piece on the data sovereignty piece. This is increasingly a live issue in all digital services. And when we talk about digital identity, we're talking about personal data and privacy. And when we're talking about personal data and privacy, we're talking about the fundamental architecture of the way that digital economies work. You know, as The Economist wrote very well a couple of weeks ago, and as everyone is endlessly saying, data is the new oil. And what we're going to see is entire new economies in this century driven by the ability to capture data and to move it between borders. Data sovereignty in our original paper for Media Networks on global private sector digital platforms was a huge issue. And the companies we spoke to who were variously building different forms of identity platform, from sometimes very simple platforms to sometimes very complex ones, really fell into two camps. Companies that actually didn't want to touch personally identifiable information at all and were looking for ways in which the user can have those ID identifiers on their device, and then what the platform does is just uses tokens to authenticate transactions. And others who believed that owning that massive information about the individual was where the value was, and they then had to deal with what are increasingly complex laws around the sovereignty of moving data across borders and protecting it within individual countries. This is not an issue, I think, that is going to get solved anytime soon. It's only going to become more complex. And it's an issue that's fought out at a relative supranational level between blocks of countries, the private sector, and other lawmakers, without really a lot of consideration for what that means for the end user and their ability to do things. I'm looking at Yasmina as the industry person initially. Is the need to keep data sovereign to a country going to be something that hinders or benefits the user in the way that platforms are built?
I think the question is more, are citizens satisfied with the way their governments are taking this decision, right? And we see very, very disparate choices made by different governments. So you see if Morpho, for example, gets a contract on ID solutions, for which they have many of, the governments typically require that they put any physical hardware facilities in that country. So they actually want, of course, job creation, but they also want a certain amount of control over any hardware and therefore also software, and they want that at the domestic level. You see other companies, for example, our global tech giants, who obviously are global entities, and when Brazil, for example, issues an order against WhatsApp to try and shut it down or procure information, it struggles to execute that order because HQ is back in the US, not in Brazil. So I actually think it's for citizens to stand up and say what they expect of their governments, and then we as private sector will sort of have to play by those rules. One point I would like to make is that, yesterday I think someone kind of called out very strongly that we need to expose mobile operator CDR data and have these big data access vehicles for consumers, data and information to be used for good, big data for social good. It's long been talked about. But then at the same side, we're saying stop data transfer cross-border, protect consumer rights, make sure we don't have information being exposed. So I think sometimes within this development community, we kind of play both sides of this argument, one being, highlight all the social good, and if we're a good actor, let us see as much as we can, and if you're a bad actor, limit the exposure and control. So I think we need to have much clearer definitions around data exposure and what is appropriate, and not get too complacent about just kind of saying that if it's for social good, then it should be acceptable, because I think it's a much more complex issue than that.
One of the things that does interest me about the data sovereign question is actually how governments aren't seeing that as an economic opportunity. If data is the new oil and there is a requirement or the desire for governments to keep data physically within their borders, then why not create a sovereign data wealth fund? Why not talk to the multinationals who want to access your citizens' data and give them licenses in the same way you did give mineral rights to oil companies, and say, if you want to drill for data in our country, then you pay a certain amount of money. Worked incredibly well for Norway over the last 50 or 60 years. And that may be a way of returning value to the citizenship from the data that comes within their country in a way that is meaningful for the future economics of the country, and prevents it in the European situation being spirited away to Luxembourg, meaning that a lot of these companies never even pay taxes in the countries that they actually derive value from. Next question is just there, and then we'll go there.
Thank you very much, Maria from Tanzania. I'm very interested in hearing about when we talk about digital identity and whistleblowing. One of the reasons is that on one end, when we talk about digital identity, we talk about transparency, about accessibility, yet at the same time, transparency and accountability includes giving opportunity for whistleblowers to anonymously be able to pass on information. And this is not only for government, but this is also for some of the most powerful multinationals. And they actually use the digital identity of people to try to mine information and to find out who the whistleblowers are. So how do we actually, in a very serious way, consider digital identity as a good thing, but also protect it very strongly from such powerful interest?
I have to go to our Privacy International panelist for that one first.
I mean, I think it all comes down to the safeguards that are in place in how the digital identity systems are being developed, and what is the purpose of them. And to think back about the decision-making process at the design level, there are whistleblowing policies that should be in place in any company. I'm not sure if they're specifically worse in the digital identity sector in terms of, individuals who work for these different companies that might want to report. I think it comes down to internal policies around ensuring the right to anyone who is concerned about a system or an idea or what's being discussed to have the opportunity to come out and speak out against that, and to enable such a system. And that was one of, just bringing it back to the question about tech sovereignty as well. I think we need to take a step back and ask for transparency as to who is even involved in which companies, Because actually, we don't even know in terms of the procurement process. It's taken, in the shadows. We don't know why is it always the same companies that win these contracts. What are the budgets being allocated to these systems versus providing healthcare and other sectors that might be necessary? So I think in terms of linking those two questions, it's definitely important. We need to understand who is providing this sort of system, for what reasons, what justifications have been given, under what conditions as well. Is it just a public-private contract that's been signed, or are there more elaborate conditions as to the different systems that have been established? And I think from a user perspective, it's not just knowing which companies, but ensuring that there's a redress mechanisms, be it from the government or the private sector, or whichever entity is providing or enabling the systems, that when you feel or you know that your right has been violated, and it could be your right to privacy, but other rights as well, that you have a mechanism in place that you can reach out to claim back those rights.
I would also just add, I find whistleblowing a really important example in how we can separate identity from verification. So saying you can authenticate information without actually knowing who gave you the information is a really powerful thing. And I think our obsession with tying IDs to people to be able to actually have information about those people, instead of thinking about what we can do to build systems so that I can retain my own information and not necessarily share it, but still be able to authenticate and verify the information is true, I think is a really important frame. I'm not quite sure how it applies particularly to users that might want to blow the whistle on a company, but I think it is a really important way of thinking about some of these issues.
Just before we go to the next question, as a personal anecdote around the way actually non-private information is used in very economic functions, we renewed our corporate insurance, our business insurance, with a company I won't name because we're no longer with them, for Caribou Digital earlier on in this year. A very good friend of mine runs Andala, a very good company out of Kenya and Nigeria that trains people to be coders and gets them contracting jobs in the US. And one of their contractors was stopped at the US border and questioned as to whether it was a coder from Nigeria, and they were questioned as to whether they really were a coder. And given everything that's going on in the US at the moment, you can imagine what that experience was like. Even worse, they were taken into a room and given a short coding test that the CBP team in the US had downloaded off the web and asked to answer it. Of course, there are a million different ways you can answer a coding question, and the answer this person gave didn't match up to whatever had been downloaded from the web. The border police were obviously not very good at coding and didn't understand the nuances of this. Eventually, the person was let in. Anyway, we tweeted support for Andala from this. We thought that was a disgusting thing for ZPB to do, and put out what I thought was a very innocuous tweet saying that the CPB should be disgusted by what they did, and this is not what we would expect. When we came to renew our insurance, I had a call with an underwriter who said they were very happy to renew our insurance, but what was our social media takedown policy? And they had associated that tweet with, and I quote, potential risk given everything that's going on at the moment. So suddenly we were in a situation where the insurance company was asking to raise our premium because they started to see us as potentially an insurance risk because of what I thought was an incredibly minor tweet in our stream to support a friend who had had something terrible happen to their relationship. So there are different ways in which data and the data we knowingly and willingly produce and share, and unknowingly and willingly produce and share, impacts us and our businesses and our activities on an ongoing basis. And it would be good to get some questions from the audience around economic uses of identity and privacy and those issues. But we will go to a question there first. Just one quick.
Just a quick comment, because the question about whistleblowing and this idea that we have one identity or one digital identity, I think is probably a wrong way of looking at it. There's the one we know about because we're enrolled in a system, but there's data being scraped from all these different sources that might create a different digital identity that we might not even be aware of, that others are using to make decisions about ourselves. So I think that's something to think about as well in terms of the discourse. and in terms of control as well.
Absolutely. The identity that's probably most impactful to you is the one you're not even aware of. Over there.
Hi.
You and then the gentleman behind
sorry,
you. Yeah.
I thought you were pointing at someone else. Hi, my name is Rebecca McKinnon. I direct the Ranking Digital Rights Project. And I'm wondering if the panelists might be able to comment a little bit on whether it would be helpful if the development aid community, both from governmental side and the private sector, were to impose some conditions on funding for digital ID development systems that might relate to, are there privacy impact assessments? Is there stakeholder consultation? Is there grievance? You know, what are the data protection structures in place, et cetera, in order to help kind of incentivize good practice, and also whether there's scope to push the companies that are involved with these systems to be more transparent, but also to adhere to some basic principles and be held accountable, commit to be held accountable to them. So, so thanks.
We'll go first for that, and I'll go to Yasmina, because I know that there are the principles for digital identity that the GSMA has been working with numerous actors to develop. That goes some way towards that.
So about 18 months ago, maybe even 2 years ago, the World Bank kicked off exactly such an initiative and said we need a set of multi-stakeholder agreed principles around what ID for D, identity for development, or in this case kind of digital identity, should look like. The World Bank was represented across the bank, so gender was represented, property rights, financial services, voting, and children, you know, kind of infant registration, etc. They then convened primarily governments, either through directly government engagement or aid agencies, and then 2 private sector members, which was MasterCard worldwide and ourselves, and then a few private foundations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundations and Media Network, etc. And that was a very, in my opinion, robust multi-stakeholder dialogue. So there was multiple rounds of meetings, there was multiple rounds of edits on the document, and what you have now is a relatively short, but I would argue fairly comprehensive set of open-ended principles which make it very clear what are the terms we think we should all be playing in. So privacy and consumer protection and consumer rights is sort of paramount. Not charging and not making money off the provision of identification is paramount. Technology neutral to the extent that that's possible, so that you are not then blocking different actors from engaging in this and creating monopolies is part of the principles. So I think it's been a really kind of good process. Now, next, what happens with it is, I think, the most important part, and that's where World Bank is going to try and drive to kind of embed these principles within national governments or within government ministries, and I think you'll see the aid community try and do the same. But I would say the next couple years of whether these principles turn into action are pretty important.
I think if we can use those principles to guide the way, particularly the World Bank ID for D groups support countries and support their ID systems, we can have a real impact there. From the private sector side, it's a bit harder. And actually, to go back to try and answer one of the previous questions we rather handily dropped, which is there any example of best practice in this space? For Alex and Alex, is there any private sector provider who we think is producing good activity or is producing a service that respects user needs well? And if not, what can we do to put pressure on them as groups of users, and sorry to use the U word again, or as civil society organizations to put pressure on them to make that work?
I mean, to answer Rebecca's question, I say yes, but I would love to see developed countries actually apply some of those principles to their own choices around digital ID. I mean, I think this idea that because the global north has the money, that they're able to impose principles that they don't actually apply in their own contexts is problematic. And maybe some of those multi-stakeholder initiatives of sort of can actually benefit the way that we're reflecting on our own practices, because it's not like we're doing something perfectly that we're exporting. It's that we're learning as we go and we're not always making the right choices. choices as we proceed. In terms of who's doing it well, I actually don't know enough about digital ID to be able to answer that question. Almost everything that I have seen around it, it has appeared to be, for lack of a better word, a dumpster fire. But there might be examples that I would love to hear about, because it would be nice to start positively modeling in this space instead of launching innovations that are actually experimentations on people and then sort of criticizing them when they fail.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think the answer is yes to the role that development sector plays, and both those that are funding, but also those that are implementing, because there are intermediaries in between. So definitely there, at Price International, it's a stakeholder group that we've been engaging with for a very long time, just also because we receive funds from development agencies and they know the work that they were doing, and we're trying to connect the piece of the puzzle and say, it's not just about what we do in our partner countries and the countries we work in, but it's also the role they play in terms of the choices they make in terms of what project they finance and what they finance. I think what's been interesting in the development sector as well is not just looking at ID system in isolation, but then trying to make the link with financial services as well. So that's something that we've seen in Uganda, for example, even though there's no data protection law, which is another comment I had, was the role that the development sector can be playing, some of the conditions they could be requiring is we will not be operating or deploying data-intensive or tech-intensive systems unless you ensure that from a legal perspective you have the safeguard in place, be it data protection law that's missing in a lot of countries where these initiatives are being deployed, but not just the existence of these laws, but the enforcement of them in the longer term as well. I think in terms of that discussion, and something we haven't quite talked about, is the need for audits. We're now seeing ADAR being seen as the best practice to then export it to there are countries in the MENA that are interested in such a model, in Africa that are interested in such a model. And we need to be, thinking about what worked and what didn't work, because in principle, the whole system is not flawed. But doing that audit, I think it's probably really important in terms of accountability as well. In terms of a best practice, a model system, I mean, we haven't seen one as such. I think there are elements that are better than others, but yeah, I wouldn't be able to say that there is someone that is doing it perfectly.
Yeah, I think if someone does come up with the identity platform that meets civil society, government, and private sector needs, they deserve a Nobel Prize of some description. Because it's very hard to manage. When we reviewed the sector for Amidia last year, we didn't really come across anything we thought was necessarily best in class. We came across a lot of people using blockchain, often without being aware of why they're using blockchain. There may be something there in the future, but at the moment, it feels more like a buzzword that gets people funding quicker than something that's materializing as a platform. We will go to the gentleman there and then down at the front here.
I am Isaac Mukama from Uganda. My question goes to one of the panelists. We live in a world where we all believe that because of the internet, we are no longer bound by the boundaries of our nations or the countries. But why is it that as internet users we are subjected to laws or to a end-user agreement, say, designed in the US or in the Netherlands? So literally meaning we are bound by the laws in the Netherlands, and some of us do not live or stay in the Netherlands or in the US. Just for example, why don't we find a way in which we could have a global end-user agreement that all of us could sign and agree and say, oh, we all must agree to this, so that our identities feel more secure and we don't ever fall into situations like this. Thank you.
That's an absolutely fantastic point. Just before going to the panel on this, I would point out that Estonia, more than any other country, has attempted to make this a reality. You can have e-residency in Estonia by filling out a form on their website. I'm not entirely convinced that that also doesn't mean that if Russia invades Estonia, you have to join the Estonian National Service. But it does give you a form of e-residency that has some indications there. But this question of kind of, we do transact as international entities with companies that are international entities but have identities that are very much caught within national boundaries. Now, we talked a bit about data sovereignty, but how do we cope with that internationalism in what is a very plural kind of transactional society on the web? Any? Yasmina.
I think it's a really tough question. I mean, I think, you know, most of the private sector we work with is nationally established and nationally regulated. So the engagement that it has with its customers tends to be very dictated by local laws. But inevitably, you are using your mobile phone or mobile connectivity to engage with a much wider and more global world. So inherently, you are being pulled into, as you say, a set of laws for which you are not a resident, and you are now being kind of beholden to, which I think sets up an interesting dilemma. I mean, I think the question of best practice is really interesting, and one example I always like to bring up is actually the UK, which is a very low talked about example, but is fascinating because the UK actually set out to have a kind of integrated ID system which linked all these different databases, which Alex was just saying has certain dangers to it. And the citizens stood up and said, no, thank you, right? That's not what we want here. Now, contrast that with Peru, who was in the middle of a civil war and said, we must have everyone identified. And the citizens said, actually, that makes sense. Contrast that with Pakistan, who 10 years ago did the same thing. Nadra was there before Adar. So I really do believe that this dynamic between all of us as residents in our country and what we hold our governments to account on this topic is important. And perhaps conversely, from my fellow panelists who said these systems are being designed by private sector, I don't see that to be the case. I think citizens and government have an enormous amount of control of what is going to happen in their respective geographies, and I think private sector is on the shorter end of that, certainly those private sector constituents who are operating at a national level.
Maybe just to respond on that point, and I'm not a citizen of any of the three countries that were mentioned, be it the UK, Pakistan, or Peru, but I think the power dynamics are completely different. In the UK, citizens had a choice to say no because it wasn't their ability to say no didn't depend on them not accessing healthcare, not accessing welfare benefits, not accessing unemployment benefits, because there are other systems in place to enable access to those services. While I see in a lot of the other countries, there's that direct link between being recognized and having a legal identity and being part of a system to be able to access those services, because there is no other infrastructure that enables them to access them. So I think the power dynamics are completely different, and so the choices that a citizen will make are completely different. And I think it's hard to draw parallels on that. And also I think this brings up the question is, we need to challenge even the very concept, the very idea of needing an identity system. There are various countries in the world that don't have unique identification system and are functioning well. Citizens are accessing the different services they need. And so why is there this agenda that you need to have an ID system to be able to provide services to your citizens? I think there is a need to challenge that discourse as well, and what it looks like in every different country.
It's interesting, the very last state that we're just finishing our identity research in India is Assam, where there's low penetration of Aadhaar because local situations, people, why do I need another national identity platform? You know, at state level, I can do everything I need. As a UK citizen that didn't want an ID platform, I think we made the right decision. Our IDs would have been held on very old PCs with unpatched Windows XP on them. It would have ended very badly. Down here.
Brilliant. Thank you. My name is Lucy. I work at Access Now. So my question, and it's going to touch upon a few things that you guys have already brought up, but in EU we have now a conversation about using digital ID as a way to authenticate yourself for usage of online platforms. And one of the things I was at a hearing a couple of weeks ago that came up is the intent question, and we've already spoken about this, and a lot of the risks that are going to come out of a system is dependent on the intent and with which it's designed, right? So my question is, to drive more at that, is what kind of intent have we seen behind the digital ID schemes that we already have? Because you decision makers are very good at saying now, actually, it's not that we're trying to get rid of anonymity, this is actually going to help anonymity. Because instead of, and in Europe we have a very tragic intermediary liability because of the Delphi ruling, for those who are familiar, it's horrendous. But, you know, so they're saying this is going to be a means to verify yourself without necessarily giving a Google account or Facebook account. You know, the token exchange will violate your privacy much less. At the same time, there's a clear motivation for them with the kind of liability links that we have created. So my question is, as civil society, you know, what kind of intent are we comfortable with? Are there different kind of motivations that we're more comfortable with than others? And then how do we make that really clear to the decision makers? And how do we, you know, cohesively stand on where the comfort level ends?
Alex?
I mean, I would ask the question of what the opportunity cost is for doing that kind of technical development when there are probably lots of other issues that would be maybe more helpful. Or, you know, if this is going to become a thing that starts out voluntarily and then sort of evolves into a system that if you don't opt into it, you're somehow not having access to services or you're not able to authenticate your identity in critical ways. And sort of just to make sure that yeah, that it will always be a voluntary thing, that if users or consumers or citizens or whatever we want to call them need it for some purpose, they then have it as an option, but that ultimately that it doesn't become a mandated thing, and if I understood the question correctly. But.
Any more responses?
Yeah, I mean, just echoing the same thing. It's when you decide to create an ID system, and it's going back to that needs assessment, why are you creating in the first place? Have you asked the individuals that are going to be part of it? Will empower them to, you know, live their way in a certain life, or enable them to make better choices or have more opportunities. But without having that element in the decision-making process, I think there's always going to be a risk that it's going to be misused as well. And I think in terms of the decision-making, it's not only at the onset of including the individual beneficiary, user, whatever we want to call them, but also in the deployment of it. And linking back to what I was saying about audits, you know, a few years down the line, going back to these individuals and saying, how are you finding? Are you still happy with the way things are working out? Are you happy? Have you been asked for more information than you thought you would? Do you feel entrapped that you can't get out? And kind of doing that assessment is whether it's still working out or not. And if not, what do we do about it? How do we reverse it? Or how do we change it moving forward?
I think across digital in general, there's the need for something akin to a fair trade organization that basically certifies a whole host of things around the way that digital products are built and managed from a commercial perspective, perhaps more than from a government perspective. But, you know, are you protecting users' data and users' rights around their data in a certain way? Are you not transducing people's kind of privacy and giving people the opportunity to select and be selective around the information that is used for different commercial purposes? Are you paying the people who are coding your product a decent wage? Mark Graham at the Oxford Internet Institute has called for a Fair Work Foundation in digital work. So I think that there are a lot of aspects around identity, privacy, and digital business models that we could build a set of principles around and look at civil society organizations that could do that. We'll go to the next question. We've got the last 10 minutes or so. I'd be interested in questions stimulating the discussion around power within the community and the family, as well as at the kind of corporate and government level, and how identity is a power architecture within small societies and communities. Malavika.
Hi, Malavika from Digital Asia Hub, Hong Kong. Wonderful panelists, but I was wondering, what would it take, given that a lot of these systems are actually deployed in low rights environments with, you know, often you can get away with doing these systems because you don't have legal protections, you don't have safeguards, and they're actually, the narrative is about innovation. We can do innovation because there's no friction caused by law and regulation. They're beta tested in environments, they're perfected on poor people who don't have the ability to know any different, and then they're exported to other countries once they're good enough for the West. So I have two questions. One, what is the obligation of people like all of you to actually step up and protect low rights jurisdictions and actually push back on some of these developments? Starting even with having someone on a panel who's actually from one of these countries. Thank you.
Very, very fair point, well made. And I put the panel together, so take the personal responsibility for the makeup of the panel. So apologies on that side. So on that question of do we, in some cases, exploit low-income and low literacy users when we're looking at how identity products work in that way, is this something we would recognize as an issue? And if so, what ways do you look at overcoming this? I mean, again, from a personal perspective, that was the absolute reason why we did our research in India, was as a way of getting those voices of rural users of Aadhaar and other platforms out into the decision makers so that they can hear directly from people where there are problems with Aadhaar and other platforms. Is this something the industry from the mobile perspective is looking at?
I mean, I think one of the interesting examples right now is to look at forcibly displaced populations or refugee communities. And I think actually if you listen to kind of the Mercy Corps of the world or International Red Cross, you actually find they are the most cautious with the type of systems they are deploying. So they think about how to collect the least amount of information. They think about how to not link these systems. They think about what is stored where and how to limit who has access to it. So I actually think there is a deep understanding that when you're dealing with identification of marginalized people, that actually you're sitting on something that could be very valuable to a nefarious actor. I think certainly the ID principles were an intent to try and start shaping some of those policies so that you couldn't then kind of swoop into a market and take advantage of these communities. Personally, from the industry standpoint, we are actively and consistently fighting regulation that puts more burdens on us to identify people, right? This is if you go to any mobile operator and talk to their regulatory individual, he or she is spending an inordinate amount of time fighting back. And it goes to the point of proportionality. We do not believe you need to have a biometric iris scan to be able to phone home. That is not something that we agree with. That being said, governments seem intent on doing that, right? And we are, beholden to national law. So I think we are attempting to balance that, but it's not straightforward, and I think the issue is going to continue to wage, and national governments claim that it is to prevent this and help the safety of communities, and we're not so convinced with that logic. I think one of the most interesting conversations I had was with the former CEO of Telenor Pakistan, a gentleman named Michael Foley, who said he was actually starting to think about how to take out granularity from his database, because he no longer felt comfortable whether he could sit on this information as the CEO of a company, knowing the kind of requests he was going to be getting. So I think there are actors who completely would agree with the question that was posed and are trying to think and fight how to deal with it, but I don't think it's straightforward given the geopolitical environment we're working in.
I would also just add that I think there's a reason that the water in Norway is clean and the water in Nigeria is not, and that the standards that companies have when they act in certain countries is bound almost exclusively by the legal liability of acting in the way that they act is allowed in those countries. So of course, innovation can become quite quickly experimentation on people, and I think I really like the phrase low rights environment, Malavika. It's a bit of a depressing term, but I think it's a really useful way of thinking about how we consider corporate liability when we think about innovation and technology in development, and the ways that this is reused in contexts where it can be a moneymaker once it's perfected. I think it's a really, really important conversation to have, and it's a really important point.
No, I mean, I completely agree as well with the question being posed is in terms of innovation and testing it. I think in terms of our role, which was part of the question as well, we definitely play a role in connecting the piece of the puzzle. We're seeing development actors coming in and wanting to deploy some initiative. We're seeing security assistance as well, programs integrating some of those, and that includes, the European Union External Action Fund, but also other bigger entities. And I think that's where, as an international organization working with the international network, where we, through the partners and the work that they're doing and others who are feeding information to us and information we gather ourselves, we're really able to do a mapping of what the problem is, what the concerns are, and how it's completely disconnected to the scores happening at a higher level, and where decisions are being made and then just dumped on a country to just run with it without really having done the actual needs and capacity assessment or the understanding of the context in which it's being deployed. I think also it brings up an interesting question as to thinking that because you deploy on a system on a small population, that it necessarily represents other contexts and that you can replicate whatever you've deployed, and if it's worked or not worked, and then deploy in other contexts. I think that raises a good question about assuming that all the conditions are the same, and so if you deploy it elsewhere, it'll work as well or as badly in those cases.
I will say it's not just corporations. One of the most disturbing things I've heard someone vocalize in meetings we've run at Caribou is from one of the largest development organizations in the world, where we were having a conversation on our identity research, and the person proclaimed that rural users in India don't have a concept of privacy, and their justification for this was around open defecation in small villages. And I thought, actually, that points to a lack of sanitation, not a lack of privacy. And it worries me that we assume privacy standards for people without, first of all, asking them, and having a sense culturally of the way privacy is structured for them and the way that's structured as individuals and as groups. But then also assuming that that gives you the right to do certain things with that person's data and identity, that gives you the right to build digital platforms in a particular way that serve your needs as an organization. It gives you fantastic data on what people are doing and where they're going, and considers those people as effectively numbers in spreadsheets rather than individuals. And I think this was a lot of the driver behind why we went to the ground and did research in India with our partners, IIITB out of Bangalore, because we fundamentally wanted to understand how privacy is structured differently for very wide groups of people, and start to get that material out there. And more importantly, in the sessions that we ran in Delhi, Bangalore, and DC, do it in a way that directly showed this to the people who are making decisions about country-level ID platforms, to have those stakeholders and others there. We probably have time for one more question, if there is one from the floor, just down there.
Hi, my name is Jack. I'm from APC, Association for Progressive Communications. I live in Malaysia. We have a biometric identity system since 2001, so we are like super experienced in this. And it boggles my mind why people really want to implement this now, in 2017. The problems are massive, not just in terms of fraud, economic fraud, voter fraud, but it also presents a whole bunch of problems when you're trying to fix something that is as fluid as identity. So, for example, religion is in the identity card. It has problems in conversion, gender transitioning, and so on and so forth. And I think the biggest problem with this whole debate is also framing digital identity as a precondition to citizenship, and as a precondition to accessing services, and to have that kind of social support. And linking that with development is another big problem as well, because then it completely neutralizes the human rights approach. And we're really talking about people, not users. I like that analogy around drug users and so on. It's really about human rights, yeah? So I think these three kind of like steps around preconditions, access to services, development, and therefore supporting certain things and trying to come to a solution, it feels like a magic trick. It's an illusion. So I really feel, let's take 3 steps back here. And I do have 2 points I wanted to raise. One is around the principles, the World Bank principles. I think if it's going to be a multi-stakeholder principle without any robust civil society participation, it's going to fail. So I would strongly recommend, if you're really going to use that, have another round, make sure that there is robust civil society participation from different sectors. That's one. The second one is that I really want to hear more around the alternative developments around authentication. I do see the value of this, yeah, to some extent. And we are talking a lot around IDs, but really around identification, but can I hear more also around alternative models that focuses on authentication instead?
So we will go on alternative models of authentication actually first, because we have seen people's data trail used to allow them to get loans, credit scores, etc., things that were not possible. Are there ways of developing identity platforms that are not biometric, not government controlled, that are fluid? I know John Clippinger out of MIT was developing ID Cubed as a platform that would allow people to own their identity and just share the fragments needed to perform a transaction without it having to be part of a national database. Is that the kind of platform we should be promoting and supporting more than the top-down government or commercial platforms? And is that realistic that you would drive adoption for that platform if we did?
I think the sky's the limit, right? I mean, authentication is a beautiful way to mask all the information that we want to mask as individuals, but I think we, as consumers, users, whatever word, citizens you want to say, need to start taking responsibility to that. And right now, we all happily click, I accept, and get on with our day. So I think there are going to be these innovations, and the pressure will be on us to actually adopt them and promote them and take back some of that control, because I think technology absolutely sets up the opportunity to have more control over who gets what information about you.
Final comments first from Alex as well.
Just to say, I think Chat's point about authentication shouldn't be necessary to be able to access basic services, I think is really just a really important point. And it goes back to Alex's point of saying, what do we need this for? Why are we doing this? What kinds of things does it add in terms of value to society? And making sure that we're not over-engineering a solution to a problem where then the solution becomes a big component of the problem. So just to echo Chat, that's a great point.
No, I think what was brought up in this question and the previous one as well is around innovation as well, and this idea that innovation is part of progress, it's part of development. And I think we need to counter this, the scores that you have to choose between innovation or exercising your fundamental rights, be it privacy or other. We at Privacy International, I think we're quite tech-savvy organizations, and we do both. We want to use, innovative tools, we want to use technology, but that can't be at the expense of privacy or the enjoyment of other rights. So I think this discussion around innovation versus privacy is a dichotomy that we shouldn't have to face, and that we should counter in our narratives as well. I think alternatives are definitely important, and maybe a bit contrary to what Yasmina was saying. I don't think it does come down to the individual to know. I think the onus is on governments, on companies to be transparent as to how the system works, and informing the individuals that they can, that there are alternatives, they can choose to opt in or out. It's not up to us to go and dig through 100 pages of terms and conditions to find that out. We should be given that information at the point of consent, at the point in which we decide that we want to be part of such a system, and to put back the onus on those actors rather than the human.
So I will close actually responding directly to the point about ID for development and why would we want these systems, especially given the kind of context around Malaysia. It does worry me that we see identity almost as a silver bullet in development, when actually a lot of the time it solves the problems of the development industry rather than solving the problems of the end user. And I think we need to give ourselves a very strong set of rules and questions we ask about why is a national ID or a regional ID platform necessary, and what function is it actually solving for people? But fundamentally, I think the thing I would like to take away from the conversation with this panel is really understanding the mutability of identity, that it is something that is socially and culturally created, it's something that's created by governments and companies, but it's also something that is constantly shifting and changing over time. And therefore, I don't know that we can create that kind of mythical, successful digital identity platform that serves everyone's needs. However, I think without some form of transactional representation for yourself in the digital space, you will not participate in the 21st century in a way that is economically and educationally and functionally useful for you. So at some point, we have to represent ourselves in the digital space in this century, or we will not be able to benefit from the various things that the World Bank's WDR 2016 report called the digital dividends. So if people want to be economically productive, want to be able to participate in debate and citizenship, they have to have some form of representation. The question for us is, how much does that need to be a solid core immutable identity, and how much can it be something that allows the individual to mutate over time and change the way that they interact with those platforms? At that point, I would like to thank Alex, and Yasmina, and thank the audience for the questions, your attention, and let you all go to lunch. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. And as Chris said, lunch is served. It's